I wanted to ask about dual perspectives, and then we'll start to think about landing this thing. But you've written about two books now about two sisters, and we've had back and forth between the sisters and their perspectives. What does that technique of telling a story allow you to do? And do you think that that's maybe like the Kelly McWilliams lane that we can look forward to more dual perspective books, or have you got it out of your system?
Oh, right. Yeah. I would say there is nothing on this earth that has given me more of a migraine than a two perspective story. Although I have friends who who have written books from even more perspectives than that. And sometimes I think, though, two might be harder even than multiple. Like the two-hander, there's just something inherently like almost contradictory about telling a story from two perspectives. You can see a story from 8 or from 5 or 4, and then it's like a well-rounded kind of a thing. But two, it's like there's competition for worldview, and it's difficult. I have a mentor who tells me, you got to quit it. You got to stop. And I'm at least taking a break. I'm interested in sort of like dualities and binaries. So I probably will return to a two-hander, two protagonist POV story, but not in the next 2 books, because we gotta do that self-care. But it was a huge challenge. It was like the probably the most challenging thing about both of these books was telling a story from 2 very different perspectives. For Agnes and Beth, Agnes she's my superhero, and she's great, and she's at heart, she's just generous and good and wise, and she's always trying her best. She's that person that we always, that you can always rely on. And then her sister Beth is absolutely so unreliable, and she is so vain, and she has so many issues, and she lets her fear get the better of her. She's a mess. But I will say I really enjoyed writing her perspective, because it's much more probably true to my life, that sort of perspective of the flawed character. And so telling the story with the 2 of them and having their different voices, but they both had to sort of achieve their story goals. They both had to grow as characters. They would see things in 2 very different ways, but one was not better than the other. It's a tricky thing to pull off. And then that's not even going into just the difficulties of time and what scene happens when and who's doing what when. That's a whole other like technical challenge. But then for Mirror Girls, we have Charlie and Magnolia. And Magnolia is my Southern Belle character. And she's a little bit more like Beth. She's off in her own world sometimes. She's been raised to believe things that, are really not going to serve her, and raised to think about race in very particular ways, being raised on this cotton plantation. And Charlie, she's the Harlem activist. So there are these points of view with friction, and it can be hard to get a tone of a book to feel like unified when you have these frictive points of view. So it's a challenge. And I would say if you can do a book in one perspective, it's going to be easier. So I'm on a hiatus from 2 POV books.
When you go through and you write them, do you write them in the more or less the order that we read them, or do you write one character for a while and just one character and then switch to the other one?
So I write them all in the order, but my characters don't stay the same through the revision process. Like normally the first note that I get is, oh, the voices sound too much alike. And then there's kind of a differentiation process where I go back through the next draft and I tell the story again, but Magnolia is more Southern than she was before. Like I remember between like the second and third draft when I was trying to get those voices distinct and also just trying to get them to, to offer more to the story, I was like mainlining Tennessee Williams radio plays and really trying to get that voice and that atmosphere for her so that she didn't just sound like kind of a watered down version of her sister. So for me, it's almost like, I don't know, it's like, I'm definitely going to get this term wrong, but it's like mitosis or meiosis. It's like the story splits, but it starts out being told the same way. I don't spend more time with one than the other. There's usually like one who's a stronger and easier for me to get And so Agnes and Charlie were easier for me to get. They're kind of like the straight man for me. And then the character that's a little more outside of the comfort zone, that's a little trickier to write, like a little more controversial or whatever it is, does tend to need a little bit more revision and fussing with.
See, I felt immediately I identified more with Beth than with Agnes, because Agnes was, I would aspire to that. That's not me, but Beth, yeah, I could be that.
Well, actually, that story went through more drafts and revisions than the other one. Like, there was no Beth at one time in the very, very first draft of the story. There was just Agnes, and she was too perfect. And it was too, sometimes, you know, the superhero needs their alter ego, and they need their weakness, and they need, they also need that other character who plays off of them. They need that sort of Batman Robin vibe. So Agnes was, you know, originally it was truly just Agnes's story, and Beth was a part of the story, but she had no perspective. And then in another draft after that, Beth started writing these letters. And I was including these letters and these diary entries from Beth. Like, she was clearly trying real hard to like be born and to speak, you know? And my agent was like, well, why don't you just give her a point of view? And I did that, and the book sort of shook into place, because you're exactly right. Agnes is aspirational, but Beth is relatable, and we sort of need that touchstone.
So how many drafts were you looking at with both of these books?
So Agnes was a lot. Agnes was like maybe 7 or 8 drafts in terms of like complete revisions. And some of them were just, you know, just redoing the third act or whatever, but some of them were full rewrites. I did a couple full rewrites, you know, in a panic on that book, because it was just, it was a big project. There's a lot going on in that story. And I had not yet learned how to plot stories in advance. So every time I wrote one of these drafts, I was just like hoping that I would get to the end point. And that had worked for me one time when I was 15, and then never again was I going to get lucky like that. And so actually, while I was working on Agnes, I read a bunch of, you know, books about creating stories. And I started using the like Blake Snyder Save the Cat beat sheet. Has been really helpful. Like, I sort of internalized that framework so that I could have a language to understand the things that I was doing and like the moves that I was making. So then Mirror Girls, it was much fewer drafts, because I'd sort of learned what I needed to do to put a structure in place in advance. So Mirror Girls was really only like 3 or 4 big drafts.